So just kind of really briefly, starting with preference within craft beer for local and regional, we see that local and regional are things that people really like in craft. So the number one reason people buy craft beer is flavor. But local aspect is a really important part. So here's some data from a survey we do with Nielsen every year. Regional and local, align with buying and what they say they're looking to buy. And you can see that those percentages are even higher for weekly craft drinkers, so kind of core craft drinkers. So regional and local certainly are the preferred preference for lots of craft drinkers. And we're seeing this in the sales trends as well. So this isn't just something that people tell us in surveys. Sometimes people say stuff in surveys. This is the time of year where everybody's going to eat right, get healthy, go to the gym all the time, and then you don't really see consumer behavior changes. But this is one place where surveys connect with the sales data. So this is also data from Nielsen. And you can see, total craft in this channel. Other channels have craft up, whether you exclude or include the large brewers. So I had BA Define Craft and IRI scan up about 2%. I think our total craft number growth will be about 4%, and that's volume, not dollars. But in this data slice, which was about mid-year from Nielsen, they looked at local craft, and they found that local craft, so they define that as brands with 85% or more volume in one state or retailer, was up 5%, whereas total craft was down 1%. One thing to draw your mind to as we move on in this too is that premium price. So that local craft often is a higher price point. This is mostly because it tends to be smaller producers, and smaller producers are just going to have different scale, and so to make their business model viable, are going to be able to charge more. But I think that also shows that there is a consumer willingness to pay for local products within craft. So that average price for a local craft 6-pack is $14.34 versus $9.26 for an average price of all craft, including large brewers. It would go up a little bit if we just did independent craft and off-premise. And so keep that memory in mind when we talk about willingness to pay later on for things with local ingredients. So what is local? Nielsen in that last slide defined it as things that have 85% or more in one state or one retailer. And this is something that people have done previous work on in food systems in particular. So there's been a fair amount of research on this. I have a quote there from the 2008 Farm Act where they talk about local regional products being those that are sold less than 400 miles from their origin, and then I've highlighted within the state in which it is produced. And I've highlighted that this is one of those places where consumers aren't completely rational. Consumers often aren't very rational. But there's growing evidence that local to consumers is really about what they define in their heads as their local area. And things like state borders can have really powerful effects here. So the picture below is a locally grown sign from your local friendly retailer, Walmart. Walmart has certainly done this research as well, and they use state boundaries. You can see there in that, look for the sign in your produce department, see what's grown locally in your state is their definition of local. And there's growing evidence that's really how consumers see this as well. My guess is in New England that there's probably also a strong affinity to the region. So that they might extend the boundaries, beyond just state boundaries to region boundaries. But the only study that I'm aware of in beverage alcohol specifically looking at this just came out about hard cider. And these researchers tested in kind of the upper Midwest, consumers, looking at willingness to pay and definitions of local around hard cider. And what they found is that state borders mattered much more than distance. So consumers were, in southern Michigan, were much more likely to think of a local product as one that came from Michigan, even if it came from, hundreds of miles away in Michigan, compared to one that, might technically be closer, but was produced in Illinois or Indiana across the border. So, as we're thinking about local here, I think it's worth remembering that this isn't going to be a strict distance and that consumers aren't going to think about this, in the supply chain just based on geographic distance. One other thing that's clearly matters to consumers as they think about local is the density of outlets. I won't read this whole quote from a paper, but this is called flexible localism when people look at this in in economic geography studies. And basically what it means is the more of something that you have, the tighter people's definition of local becomes. So I have two brewery maps here on very different scales. One is of a swath of Mississippi, which basically has 0 breweries. So you can see, there's 2 breweries on this map. I'm guessing the people who drink craft in Greenville, Mississippi, think of those 2 dots as their local breweries. The other map is of Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon, obviously, very, very dense set of breweries. So we could do a similar map with Portland, Maine. And here, you really get people having neighborhood definitions of local. So, what is local is going to vary a lot based on the density of outlets. And so, a local grain producer in a place where there are lots of grain producers or there are lots of options is probably going to be seen by fewer, or the distance is going to matter more for people as compared to a place where there aren't as many of those producers. And so consumers are going to define local more tightly. All right. With that said, a few more stats on kind of, does this matter to brewers to consumers and how much? So here are the things that the consumers care about in buying craft. Number one is flavor, and in the long run, this is going to be part of the value proposition. Some of it is going to be the idea that locally made products are better for the local economy, have benefits to the state or region. But if local products can deliver what consumers see as better flavor, that's certainly going to be a value add that drives it home. I wanted to draw everyone's attention to 2 more things on here. So the first is that locally made. We've already seen some of these stats, but continues to be very important to people. But ingredients is more important. So when we survey people on why are you buying something, ingredients is more important than locally made, at least in consumer surveys to craft beer purchasers. And so I think the challenge for local products is to show people why those local ingredients that they should care about. Within the beer industry, clearly, hops have captured people's imagination, and so consumers are now willing to pay for hops that they know and that they like. That's kind of a crazy revolution. The average consumer couldn't name a single hop. Most consumers didn't even know what hops were 10 or 20 years ago, and now you get people who are buying things because it says Citra on the package. But I think there's kind of a big opportunity here in general for the malt grain side but it has to come with the story of why these ingredients matter. And why consumers should purchase based on those local ingredients and those local inputs, which is something that we know consumers already care about. All right. I want to switch briefly to kind of why I think local has an opportunity to really have a moment, and that's the need to differentiate in a competitive environment. So when we talk about the craft brewing market, and these are slides that anyone who's seen me present will have seen variations of recently, but the segment has never been stronger, and the market has never been more competitive. This is the big contradiction we see right now. So market share is higher than ever before. There are more breweries than ever before. There are more beer choices than ever before. It's never been a better time to be a beer lover. And as a collective, the craft beer market has never been stronger. That said, it's getting sliced up with 8,000, then 8,002, then 8,004. We're still at about a net increase of 2 breweries a day. And so the market has never been more competitive. And for breweries, this means it's more important than ever to differentiate. They have to do something differently. Briefly, I'll say that this isn't going to go anywhere. Here's some data on the number of TTB permits and then the number of active breweries in our database 2 years later. So that's TTB permits at the end of 2016, and then the number of breweries at the end of 2018. 2 years later, you can see that these have a very tight relationship. At the end of 2018, we had more than 10,000 brewing permits. We don't have final 2019 numbers yet, but I think that permit number is going to end at about 11,500. And there's some reasons why we're not going to see that same 2-year lag hold as well in an era of closings and when not all the breweries in planning decide to open or can't get funding to open. But it's pretty clear that this competitive situation that I just described is only going to get tighter in the next couple of years, and so it's going to underline that need to stand out. I want to show an animation next that kind of illustrates this. It'll take about 45 seconds, and this is all the brewery openings in the country over the last 30 years. So now we're 20 years ago. You can see the data in the upper left. Now last 10 years. All right. What's amazing about that graph and or that animation is I think it really shows not just that we're continuing to get an increase in the number of breweries, but that increase is at least until recently been accelerating. So we're getting more breweries faster than ever before. And the need to differentiate is only getting stronger in particular places because one of the interesting things when you look at this geographically is that most breweries are going in where there are already a lot of breweries. So anyone in Vermont or southern Maine is going to be familiar with this. But this graph shows the number of permits per capita. These are just TTB permits for every state in 2016. So Vermont's that dot that's way out on the far right. And then the y-axis is the increase, the change in the number of permits per capita over the next 3 years. And so you can see that these things have a strongly positive relationship. And basically what this graph is showing is that the places that already have the most breweries continue to get the most breweries. So places where it's already the most competitive are the ones where the most new breweries are going in or looking to go in. And, again, I think this just underlines the need in those places to stand out in the coming years and to do something unique and original. And I think that, certainly local ingredients have the possibility of being one of the things that helps breweries, stand out and not just be another local company making an IPA with, ingredients from the same places that everybody else is doing so. This is happening in other parts of beverage alcohol as well. I'm not going to spend as much time on that. But this brewery permit rise is being, matched by U.S. winery permit rise, U.S. distillery permit rise. U.S. wineries are going in all over the country. This isn't just California, Oregon, Washington. And the distillery numbers look pretty similar to the brewery numbers on a 10 or 15-year lag. So we're starting to see more local producers, across all sorts of beverage alcohol, as well as other parts of small brewing. And the local movement certainly extends beyond beverage alcohol as well. So, farmers markets aren't the only way that people buy local food. We've already seen the Walmart picture, but they're certainly kind of one of the best and most visible forums of local food purchasing. So here's a graph of the number of breweries plotted against the number of farmers markets. I actually think this farmers market graph is a pretty good model of what brewing might look like over the next few years as we continue to see breweries increase, but obviously that curve starts to flatten and slow as fewer open and a few more close. So this is just kind of underlining the point that these demand trends are driven by kind of broader societal trends. We see it across beverage alcohol. We see it across food systems. People are more interested than ever in where their food and beverage comes from, and more interested than ever in buying locally, with the caveats that local varies in what people think about it. That said, I think the demographics going forward pose a challenge and opportunity both for craft brewers as well as for local suppliers who are looking to sell into those craft brewers and local craft brewers who are trying to make all local products. And I say this because the country is starting to age, and I'll show an animation that illustrates this in a second. But you can see here that here are some indicators of variety purchasing. That the percentage of brands that people say they purchase is going down. Obviously, we've had a proliferation of brands in recent years, which has been part of it. You can't buy as many brands from as many people as you used to be able to because there's just so many brands out there. But I think a lot of this is driven by particularly the millennials aging over time. People still use millennial as a kind of a code word for young, but that's really not accurate anymore. Millennials are from their mid-20s to their late 30s, depending on where you draw the cutoff. And the average millennial is in their kind of early 30s now. And I think we're starting to see that in their purchase decisions and their desire for kind of more consistent brand purchasing and less variety, which again underlines that need to stand out in the marketplace. If they're not picking 5 or 10 brands, they're only picking a few. What are you doing to ensure you're that choice for a purchaser who maybe only buying beer once or twice a week now? So here's that animation I talked about. This is the U.S. population from 2010 up to, I think I did this through 2040. And I wanted to do this because, I think one of the biggest opportunities for beer in the next, 10 to 20 years is to continue to find ways to move up market. We've had a generation that's really attuned to craft with the millennials, but they're going to get older. I mean, you can see that peak on the left is the millennials, and you can see them, slowly aging up to, the peak starting to hit about 50 in 2040. And the numbers on this graph, show how our beverage, core beverage alcohol market is going to age over the next few years. So from 2020 to 2030, the number of 21 to 34-year-olds is basically static. So it'll increase a little bit. We'll have 200,000 more 21 to 34-year-olds. But the number of 35 to 44-year-olds and 45 to 54-year-olds are both going to increase. So we're going to have almost 6 million more 35 to 44-year-olds in 2030 as we do in 2020, and about 1.5 million 45 to 54-year-olds. And so those purchasers, people are going to look to purchase differently. In general, their incomes should be higher. We'll see what happens with the U.S. economy over the next decade. But they're typically going to buy fewer products and higher quality products. That's what we see in the beverage alcohol market, is that people tend to actually spend more over time, even as they buy less. And so I think, again, when we think about kind of the local ingredient market and where that's going to play, that's a big opportunity to continue to allow people to trade up within craft as they age. All right. So kind of closing here, talking a little bit more explicitly about the viability of local ingredients and where some of the opportunities exist and where there's still limitations. And particularly on the grain side, people need to continue to tell that local story and really convince consumers that it's worth paying for this, which I'm not convinced that they believe yet. So first, we asked people, there's been a lot of talk about kind of, health and wellness, which I don't love talking about health and wellness in relation to beverage alcohol in general, but, whatever you want to call it, lifestyle brands, mindful drinking, the kind of characteristics that people care more about in drinking than they used to. And a lot of the conversation there in recent years has been focused around low calorie, low carb, organic, gluten-free, non-alcoholic. But when we surveyed craft drinkers on this, last year, and we asked them, which of the following mindful drinking choices are you more interested in now compared with a few years ago? The number one answer was made with local ingredients. And that was even higher amongst weekly craft drinkers. So, I think this is kind of where local really can make hay in the coming years, is by selling to a group of consumers who are more interested than ever before in what they're putting in their bodies. I think all of these characteristics are about, people caring about what they're consuming, but telling a story about, why local ingredients should fit into that lifestyle. And all the rest of these, not all the rest, most of the rest of these categories are kind of exploding in the marketplace right now. We're going to have the summer of low-cal, hazy IPAs. The hard seltzers are exploding based on low-calorie, low-carb, gluten-free. There's lots of chatter about non-alcoholic, though. There's a lot more talk in the media than you actually see it in the numbers. But I also think that's going to be a growth area. But I think there's been less around local ingredients, despite the fact that clearly in surveys we see this is one of the places that people who are interested in what they're putting in their body within craft, this is just of craft drinkers, really care about. The biggest question is, I think hopefully I've showed you now that people care about local, but will they pay, and can brewers afford to pay for this? So here's just some average price data. This is just independent craft brewers, so it doesn't include large brewers, so slightly different prices than some of the Nielsen stuff we showed before. But you can see that 6-pack average price, that growth has slowed a lot. A competitive market means that it's tougher than ever before for brewers to see price increases in the marketplace. And with so many choices, consumers are less likely to maybe want to pay a couple dollars more because they have so many great options at a lower price point. And so, I think this is the central challenge for local going forward, is that in a competitive era where there are lots and lots of options, how do you find that kind of sweet spot where you convince people to continue trading up, even when overall craft pricing is stagnated, and how do you get brewers to really lean into these brands? And if you remember, I drew attention to the fact that local 6-pack prices, of brands that are sold primarily in one state or with one retailer, are much higher than these, so kind of $4-ish higher. And I don't have the ability to pull those out in the price data. But I think that's kind of the place where local can really play is with a consumer who's already decided that they're willing to pay a little bit more than just kind of the general market price, and willing to pick something that stands out. There are a few willingness to pay studies, so I kind of scanned the literature on this. Most of them have been about organic, and they haven't necessarily shown exactly what I think this group would want to hear. What they typically show is that people say they like these products more, but that they aren't actually willing to pay any more money for them. So that one study there, the Pullmans and Rousseau, that's a study that was done in Belgium, actually not in the United States, but they looked at a variety of characteristics. In wine economics, these are very popular. They're called hedonic pricing models, but they looked at what they wanted and what they were willing to pay for. And they found that organic, in and of itself, consumers weren't willing to pay any more for, but they were willing to pay more for organic plus local, and that's where they really saw the demand. So you sometimes have to bundle these things and kind of tell a more complete story. I think this goes again, the people who are willing to pay more for this are the people who care about more about what they're putting in their body and kind of the whole package of ingredient choice. I'll also say as a caveat that these studies are kind of often overly broad. So yeah, maybe the general public isn't willing to pay more, but if you find a subgroup of people and target them, and market, specifically to them, there may be greater opportunities. So local ingredients are probably never going to be something that, the vast majority of Americans care about. Walmart still sells a lot more produce than local farmers markets, but obviously local farmers markets have found a vibrant niche with a particular set of consumers, and that's probably the same subset that are going to be looking to buy beer made with locally malted products. This can take different forms, so I wanted to run through a few examples. I think everybody will be kind of broadly familiar with these, of kind of some of the models that we might see evolving for local ingredients. So the first is kind of the big beer model isn't quite the right word, but this is obviously a large brand, and tip of the cap to Molson Coors. They were one of the first to really invest in kind of all local, and to build a brand around this. So this is their Colorado native brand, only sold in Colorado. Made with all Colorado ingredients. Maybe hasn't taken off quite like they wanted, but they really invested in that local supply chain and were willing to commit to buying all local products and really start to build a market there. So this is kind of one model where you build a whole brand line specifically around local, but it's separate from kind of the core offering. So this has not been something that necessarily has been integrated into the broader Molson Coors lines. There's a little bit of marketing around Colorado barley and Colorado water within Colorado and kind of the greater region itself, but this is kind of an isolated part of the company that they have chosen to. A second is to try to integrate it kind of with the ethos of the company more broadly. You have specific brands, but then you build a kind of a brand or broader company-wide initiative around this. So this is the Allagash 16 Counties brand, but more broadly, this has been tied into a whole set of efforts by the company to tie themselves to a place and to market around that. I think this is probably the one that you would see the most craft brewers follow, not necessarily spinning off just a local brand like in the Molson Coors example, the AC Golden example, but building this into kind of the ethos, and you have specific brands around it, but then it kind of runs more broadly throughout the community. And then I think there's also then opportunities in the super hyper local sourcing. This is an example from Napa Valley, which I think does show that people are willing to pay when you really tell a story. I think this is one of the companies I've seen that's doing the best at this. So this is a company called Mad Fritz. They're in the Napa Valley. You can see from those beer bottles, that's beer, not wine, that they have really adopted kind of that Napa Valley ethos in terms of the labels, what they do. But I've also included the back of their label there. They're very specific about where everything comes from. And this is an interesting one because it's not necessarily just local, but they call it origin beer because they're very specific about the origins. So you can see where the hop source is from, where the barley source is from. Those aren't necessarily the same place. They actually even use, the water source is something that they tell stories about, and why the water is important from particular places. But I think this is kind of another high-end model that we might see more brewers, really engage in, where they really tell, very much a wine story around, the terroir of all of their ingredients, why this matters, and then why you should pay more for it. And I should note that these bottles are $25 to $30 a bottle. They're pricing them in line with Napa Valley wine. and are selling beer out of their tap room at prices that are double what you often see in craft brewery tap rooms. So there's clearly a market for this. This is still a niche, and Mad Fritz is a small producer, but I think that shows some of the variations that might exist going forward. Kind of one cautionary tale is local hops. Local hops were something that we really saw explode for a few years, but have now come back down to earth. So I'm defining local here as basically just anything that isn't the Pacific Northwest. And you can see that we've actually seen a decrease over the last few years. There are a variety of reasons for this, that infrastructure didn't keep pace. I think craft brewers, haven't necessarily told the local hop story, needed to connect that market to the consumer in a way that they're willing to pay the prices that you need to pay if you're going to have local hops in your beer. And some of this too is a story of large brewers building demand in certain places. So we've seen hops decline in Colorado because the Colorado native contracts have come up and they haven't renewed a lot of them. So I wanted to put this in as kind of a cautionary note for the grain side that there can often be a lot of enthusiasm, but this really has to be connected with the story, the marketing, brewers telling why you should care about this for that growth to continue. And we shouldn't sneeze at the fact that there are 2,400 acres of hops outside the Pacific Northwest in the U.S. That's a lot of hops. That's a big market now, but it's certainly not one that we continue to see exploding over time. All right, so I think I'm running pretty close to the time that I wanted to hit so that we could have some Q&A. So to kind of sum up, local has always been a big part of craft demand. We see this in a variety of places, and if anything, that's increasing. So sales for local breweries continue to outpace those of regional and national. Even regional craft breweries tend to do best within 300 miles of their brewery. And so local has always been a big part of craft demand. Local ingredients, outside of the Pacific Northwest and particular places have been less important historically. But I think we're at a moment where there's an opportunity to change that. And a lot of that's going to be around differentiation. So in the next, 5 to 10 years, we have the confluence of really two things, an aging craft demographic and a much more competitive marketplace. And, I think that's where local ingredients can play, on both sides to help consumers who already drink craft to see places where they see differentiated products that they're willing to pay a little bit more for as they age, but also to help breweries stand out in a crowded marketplace by, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. It's one thing to be a local brewery. It's another to do things definitively in your business that show your connection to the local market. And there's other ways to do this, we see companies, doing lots of other things, becoming B Corps and doing all sorts of local charities and fundraisers. But certainly local grain is another way to show that you're connected to the local community and being a local brewer means more than just having a brewery on Main Street. And what I'm talking about here is kind of that final bullet. So the work is going to be connecting, this to stories and building willingness to pay amongst consumers. It's one thing to have these, great options out there around local supply chain, but it's hard work and market building to convince consumers that they should spend an extra $1 on their 6-pack or, whatever the cost needs to be to support that infrastructure, to make this work and to put in the infrastructure necessary to make these sustainable systems where brewers can rely on that supply chain going forward. If we have time, I'm happy to take a few questions, which I guess we need to type into the chat. So if not, then I hope everyone has a great conference, and thanks for having me. Oh, looks like we can't do Q&A, so thank you again, and have a great rest of your meeting.